In the 1970s, America was gripped by fear as a charming, seemingly harmless man preyed upon young women. His name was Ted Bundy, and his reign of terror is considered one of the most chilling true crime stories in history. Over the span of 4 years, Bundy committed unspeakable acts, brutally murdering dozens of women, while presenting himself as a polite, educated, and even likable individual. Ted Bundy wasn't the typical monster people imagined a serial killer to be. He didn't lurk in the shadows or send waves of terror through dark alleys. He was charismatic, articulate, and good-looking, qualities that allowed him to gain the trust of his victims. But behind that charming exterior was something much darker, a predatory nature that led to one of the most infamous killing sprees in American history. Ted Bundy was born on November 24, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont. He had an unremarkable childhood, at least on the surface. Raised by his grandparents, his grandfather was reportedly abusive, both physically and emotionally, which may have played a role in shaping Bundy's later violent tendencies. Bundy was led to believe his mother was actually his sister for much of his early life. This secretive family dynamic may have contributed to the deep psychological fractures that would later shape him. As Bundy grew older, he seemed to embody the all-American boy next door. He was smart, confident, and ambitious. In college, he studied psychology, and by all accounts, he had a bright future ahead of him. He even worked at a crisis hotline, where he helped people in distress, showcasing the terrifying duality of his nature. But lurking beneath the surface of his charming exterior was a dark and violent obsession with control and power. It was the 1970s, and young women across the Pacific Northwest began disappearing without a trace. In 1974, Linda and Healy, a University of Washington student, went missing from her home. Her disappearance was just the beginning of what would become a horrifying pattern. Over the next several months, several other young women, including students and hitchhikers, vanished from Washington, Oregon, Utah, and Colorado. They were all between 15 and 25 years old, and most were slender, with long brown hair parted in the middle. Bundy had a very specific method of luring his victims. He often wore a fake cast on his arm or leg, pretending to need help carrying something to his car. His charming demeanor made women feel at ease, and they'd willingly help him, only to be abducted, assaulted, and murdered. The pattern of disappearances across state lines frustrated law enforcement, as they initially failed to connect the dots. Ted Bundy was cunning. He knew how to blend in, and he targeted places where the authorities weren't yet on high alert. For a time, he was unstoppable. One of the most pivotal moments in the Ted Bundy case came on July 14, 1974, at Lake Sammamish State Park in Washington. On that sunny afternoon, 2 young women, Janice Ott and Denise Naslund, disappeared from the park, never to be seen alive again. Witnesses reported seeing a handsome man with his arm in a sling, approaching women and asking for help with his sailboat. He introduced himself simply as Ted. For the first time, authorities had a detailed description of the suspect: his looks, his mannerisms, and his name. This was the beginning of the end for Bundy, but it would still be years before he was finally caught. Ted Bundy's first arrest came in August 1975, when police in Utah pulled him over during a routine traffic stop. Inside his car, they found burglary tools, handcuffs, a crowbar, a ski mask, and other suspicious items. At the time, authorities still didn't know they had a serial killer on their hands, but Bundy was arrested for the kidnapping of Carol Duranche, a young woman he had attempted to abduct earlier that year. Duranche's escape was crucial in leading to Bundy's first conviction. She had bravely fought off Bundy, managing to get out of his car after he tried to handcuff her. Her testimony and Bundy's growing list of suspicious behavior resulted in him being sentenced to prison for kidnapping in 1976. But Ted Bundy wasn't done yet. In 1977, while awaiting trial for a murder charge in Colorado, Bundy managed to escape from custody twice. The first escape came when Bundy jumped from a courthouse window while preparing for his defense. He was on the run for 6 days before being recaptured. Then, in December of the same year, Bundy escaped again, this time by climbing through a hole in the ceiling of his jail cell. He shed about 30 pounds to fit through the gap, showcasing his determination and calculating mind. His second escape allowed him to flee to Florida, where his killing spree would continue. By early 1978, Ted Bundy was in Florida, and the authorities had no idea where he was. He had successfully blended into his new environment, but his urge to kill hadn't diminished. On the night of January 15, 1978, Bundy broke into the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University, where he brutally attacked 4 women. 2 of them, Lisa Levy and Margaret Bowman, were murdered, while the other 2 miraculously survived his violent assault. The sorority house killings were gruesome. Bundy used a log to bludgeon his victims, and his brutality left the entire campus and community in shock. Just a few weeks later, Bundy struck again, abducting and killing a 12-year-old girl named Kimberly Leach. Her body was discovered months later, marking Bundy's final known murder. Ted Bundy's reign of terror finally ended on February 15, 1978, when he was pulled over by a Pensacola police officer for driving a stolen vehicle. Once again, it was a simple traffic stop that led to his arrest. This time, Bundy knew his days of freedom were numbered. He was charged with the Florida murders, and his trial became one of the first to be televised nationally. During the trial, he proposed to his girlfriend, Carol and Boone, in the courtroom while she was on the stand. Boone, who believed in his innocence, accepted the proposal. During his trial, Bundy famously acted as his own attorney, relishing the attention and the chance to manipulate the court. But his charisma wasn't enough to save him. The evidence, including bite marks on one of his victims that matched his dental records, was overwhelming. Bundy was convicted of the murders and sentenced to death. The trial drew massive media attention, with Bundy becoming somewhat of a twisted celebrity. Women would come to court just to catch a glimpse of him, with some even professing their infatuation with the killer. Bundy thrived on this attention, showing how deeply narcissistic and manipulative he was. Even after his conviction, Bundy's full body count was unknown. He had been linked to at least 30 murders across several states, but many believed the number could be higher. In the years leading up to his execution, Bundy began to confess to more murders, providing chilling details about his crimes in interviews. His confessions were an attempt to delay his execution, as he tried to bargain for more time by promising to reveal more details about his victims. Bundy's confessions showed how he carefully selected and lured his victims, all the while hiding his violent tendencies behind a mask of charm and normalcy. He claimed that pornography had fueled his violent urges, but psychologists believe Bundy's need for control and power over others was at the root of his crimes. On January 24, 1989, Ted Bundy was executed in the electric chair at Florida State Prison. Crowds gathered outside the prison, cheering and celebrating the end of Bundy's life. For many, his execution marked the conclusion of a long nightmare, but for the families of his victims, it was merely a symbolic end to the years of pain and suffering. As the case of Ted Bundy was closed, one question still lingers. What do you think drove him to become a serial killer capable of such horrific acts? While the exact reasons may never be fully understood, many believe a combination of factors: his troubled childhood, early exposure to violence, deep-seated insecurities, and an inability to form healthy relationships contributed to his violent tendencies. His charming exterior masked a darker need for control and dominance, which escalated into his brutal killings.